Chapter 4 of Three Crossing Paths by Izabella Eva. Ireland. Paul sat cross-legged on the floor in his small room. He slowly opened his eyes. These experiences were getting more and more vivid, he thought. He heard a name this time. He didn't always hear the conversations. He could see the people or creatures or beings, but often couldn't recollect the dialogue. This time it was stronger, and he was sure the creature, who seemed to be their leader, was referred to by the title or name Slatromi. He understood some of the words: crystals, Egypt, and natural disaster. He looked at his watch. Compline would soon start. He had just enough time to write down what he saw and heard before it became a distant foreign memory. Paul stood up and moved to his old wooden desk. He preferred this to some of the new modern suites and started to write. His room was compact, but sufficient for his needs. He had a single bed with a wooden headboard, which housed a number of small shelves, where he kept his books, reading lamp, and clock. This was aesthetically pleasing and useful as well. Well designed. The French appreciated good design, and he was no different. The wardrobe was utilitarian and had a feeling of the arts and crafts. Then there was a small sink with a cupboard tucked away under one of the windows. He liked that. He liked brushing his teeth and looking out at the beautiful Irish scenery, the Emerald Island. There were times it was green, just like an emerald. The bells rang. Paul stopped writing. He managed to write most of what he saw. He grabbed his brown robe, put it on, and left the room. He entered the church just as the 8th bell rang. He enjoyed Compline. He took his pew. All his brothers were there. A full house tonight. There were a few guests and visitors sitting in the aisles. He was still wondering about his meditation earlier. Was that as real as sitting here? Father Anthony rose to lead the prayer. Paul went through the motions of participating in Compline, but part of him was still in the world of his meditation. The church was suddenly quiet, and he realized people were leaving. He sat and waited. He closed his eyes, as if in prayer, and attempted to mentally get back to the auditorium full of those beings. He wanted to see Slatromi again. Then he was there. He saw the room. But this time it was empty. He tried to visualize all those beings again, to direct his meditation, but nothing happened. He was disappointed. He never had a problem with directing his meditations before. Maybe he was too tired, but he didn't feel tired. He opened his eyes and left the church. When he went outside, he saw Father Terence and Father Anthony talking. He liked Father Terence. He was sorry that he wasn't his mentor. He was a tall, rotund man, very jolly, with sharp eyes. He was sure he knew more than he let on. He watched Father Anthony walk away from Father Terence, who seemed to be waiting. As he came nearer to him, he said, "Good evening." "Bonsoir," said Father Terence. "How are you keeping, Brother Paul?" "Well, thank you. I couldn't help but notice you were a little distracted in Compline." Paul thought of those perceptive eyes, tinged with pain, definitely pain behind them. "No, I am fine, Father Terence. I just had something on my mind. Do you have time for a little walk?" Paul, surprised, said, "Of course." If only he was less preoccupied so he could give his full attention to Father Terence during the walk. He wondered, should he tell him what happened? If anyone would be tolerant, he thought Terence was the most likely. Father Terence led the way behind the church, past the guest house, and to the path through the woods. "How long have you been with us, Paul?" "It has been 3 months. Are you here for 3 months more?" "Yes, and then I return to my monastery at home in France." "I remember hearing that you came to us before, taking your solemn vows to know in absolute certainty whether you were doing the right thing." "Yes, Father Terence. I wanted to be sure. It is, after all, a very big commitment." "Yes, it is. And are you finding your time here helping you come closer to your feelings?" "Yes and no. I thought I was, but something recently happened which I cannot explain. Would you like to talk about it?" In the woods it was getting dark, quite dark now. The air was brisk, and every so often they walked through a cloud of midges. Visibility was still possible as speckled light streamed through the leaves of the trees. It was a dry, crisp night. Paul loved this weather. He loved the crisp, fresh air on his face. The air was definitely different from France's, but maybe he was just romanticizing this place. This was his chance. He needed to talk to someone, and here God had asked this man, Father Terence, to come and help him resolve and make sense of what was happening. This was not a coincidence, but the hand of God, le main de Dieu. Terence sensed the turmoil in these young Frenchmen. He started to sense it a few days ago, but tonight it was more obvious. Someone had to talk to him. He wondered why his mentor, Father Anthony, didn't relieve him of his suffering. Father Anthony, it was true, was not the warmest or perceptive of individuals. He was very cerebral and spoke French. It was the French which probably made the abbot choose him as a mentor. Or perhaps the abbot thought Paul was too romantic for his own good. He knew across the tables at dinner Paul looked out of place, like he was here but not here. Oh, he was devout enough, but becoming a monk and belonging to a community required more than devoutness. Over the years there had been a few devout brothers who came to the monastery, and sometimes suggesting they spend time in the outside world first was more appropriate. Shock, depression, and just devoutness gave the man the belief he needed to take orders and join a monastery. But joining a monastery was not running away from your problems. God knows there are many problems living in an all-male community. Most of those who the monastery sent out into the world never returned again. Paul may be one of those. He may have another path to travel. The path of the monk may not be his, thought Father Terence. Father Terence, I don't know if you know, but I stayed in a Buddhist community before joining a Catholic one. No, I didn't know that. Well, I did. Although my parents are Catholic and I was baptized and took my first communion, we were not really a very religious family. I think we went as far as we did because of tradition, really. France, being a republic, does not really condone any form of religiousness. It is not fashionable. However, from a young age, I sensed the presence of a force greater than our own, a hand that moved in strange and mysterious ways. Le main de Dieu. I started to acknowledge and sense the presence of God, or something more than human. When I left home and went to university, I wanted to understand more, and so I studied philosophy. Not just French empiricism like Descartes, but the more spiritualistic, pantheistic view of Spinoza. Through Spinoza, I delved into Eastern philosophy, Taoism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. I definitely felt akin to Buddhism. When I graduated, I traveled and settled in a Buddhist community in Turkey. I learned how to meditate. But it wasn't enough for me, spending time in Turkey. I discovered the Byzantium and was drawn to the cult of the icon, the ancient Christian tradition. I was drawn to Christ and the apostles. I found every time I passed a church, I went in and sat and prayed. One time I was sitting, focusing on Christ on the crucifix, when all of a sudden it felt like I was experiencing the horror and pain of being nailed to the cross. The pain was so acute I thought I would die. Then, just as suddenly, I had an overwhelming feeling of compassion and forgiveness. He forgave his torturers. Even in his great pain, he could forgive. I started to cry and just sat there for what seemed like hours. Tears were streaming down my face. I knew then that I wanted to be in Christ's world. A few months later, I joined the monastery in France, explained Paul. God tells us in many different ways, and it seems he definitely has a mission for you, Father Terence quickly reflected. It was getting harder to walk in the dark. The woods now completely obscured any light. Father Terence said, I think we should make our way back inside. I know of a quiet room where we can continue our conversation with a nice cup of tea. Would you like to? He asked Paul. Yes, thank you. They turned and started to retreat over those steps, back towards the monastery. They entered the cloistered area, only for monks, and Terence led them to a small chamber off the dining room. First we'll just stop in the kitchen and make a drink. What would you like? A coffee, please. Ah, yes. You're not used to our tea. No, it is just I always like a small cup of coffee in the evening. Doesn't it keep you up? Doesn't make a difference. I do not sleep very well anyway. Father Terence made the drinks and didn't respond to this. He kept thinking how much inner turmoil this Frenchman had. Grand. Now let's go sit down. My feet have enough contact with the floor for now. They walked back to the small room, cosy in a simple way. Paul was glad the Benedictines did not value austerity as some of the other orders. The small square room had an old floral sofa against one wall. Then there were 3 armchairs in various tones of colour, faded red and green, tossed around the room. An old wooden utilitarian lamp stood by the sofa. Terence walked over and switched it on. He laughed. just like one's granny's sitting room, the sipper. He sat on the sofa and put his mug on the small wooden table on the side. The sofa looked much smaller with Terence sitting on it. Paul pulled one of the armchairs towards the sofa. He sat quietly, just rhythmically stirring his coffee. Terence watched with interest. He wanted to help this man through his turmoil. Terence was one of the few monks in the abbey who was genuinely interested in people. He never judged, just accepted them for who they were. They were all God's creations. God has a reason for creating people the way they are. As a mere mortal, he knew he could never understand the full reasons. Often he heard people say, "How can God exist with so much evil in the world?" But he thought the evil presented challenges to us and made us grow and develop and find a way of changing evil. That was the secret. Paul stopped stirring and looked up into Terence's eyes. "I started to say that I meditate in a Buddhist tradition at times. Lately, something different has been happening. I sit in my room, on the floor, on my small rug, and start to focus on my breath. When I find I'm transported into another room. A circular room, made out of rock. It looks almost crystalline. There are many strange creatures there. I say creatures because they are not all human-looking. Some look like large animals. Some are almost ethereal-looking. In the center of all these creatures stands a being of human or animal origin. He is tall and has golden white hair all over. He wears a large white cloak. I saw him addressing all these creatures and talking about the earth and how the environment was changing. He said there was a way of solving the problem in the Middle East. Then when he stopped talking, I came back to my room. It was as if he called me and wanted me present. I seemed to be sitting on one of the benches around the circle. It was extraordinary. It was like I was really there. I could feel the breath of the others on me." Terence was silent, and then he asked, "You said that it happened a few times. What happened the other times, and when?" "Well, none of them was as real as this last one, but before I found myself walking down these corridors, which are made from a crystalline rock. Another time I walked out and was on snow. The time I was walking down the corridor, I met the speaker, whose name I now know as Slatromi, and he greeted me." Terence surprised us. "What did he say?" "He just said, 'Welcome, Paul.'" Terence sat silently thinking, "What do you think it means?" "This is what's puzzling me," answered Paul. "I am desperate to know more. I want now to rush to my room and start meditating to see if I can go back and see if I am told more." Terence knew some of his brothers would think this is a blasphemous, the work of Satan. An animal man in white robes was definitely a version of Satan rather than God. He felt there was something significant here, but didn't fully understand it. He would have to pray for guidance. He studied Paul. He seemed slightly more relieved, and sharing his experience seemed to have made him more relaxed. "Paul, I would advise you not to tell any other monk what you've told me. Some, I fear, will misinterpret it. I can only say I am puzzled on how to interpret it, whether it is your unconscious mind interpreting events in such a manner, or whether you are actually witnessing another world. If it happens again, let me know. I would suggest you pray to God for light as well." Paul was grateful for Terence's response. He now had an ally to share these strange experiences with. They finished their drinks, washed their cups, and departed to their separate rooms. Matins would be soon enough. Paul in his room washed while looking out of the little window. The moon bathed the grounds in a soothing opalescent light. He was excited by his conversation with Father Terence, definitely one of God's people, a kind, thoughtful and generous man. He climbed into bed and laid awake thinking. He couldn't relax. He wanted to know more. He got out of bed and sat on his rug. He would meditate and see what happened. Slowly he started to focus on his breath. Watching his breath, his mind drifted to his conversation and slowly drifted back to his breath. This seemed to go on for a while, when suddenly Paul entered another room of rock, and Slatromi was there with his large bear and a woman.